welcome to the Forward Thinking Podcast. It's Chrissy here from CS2. Today's podcast is on everyone's favorite topic, attribution, if you guessed it. And I have one of, I would say someone who's dedicated a lot of time to learning about attribution, consulting on it, and has nailed down a bunch of best practices. So I have Carey Picklesimer here, and she's the owner and independent consultant at Condurrio. And I got inspired, and I Carey and you and I have talked about being on the podcast before, but I received her newsletter, and it talked about the do's and don'ts of attribution. And I was like, okay, we need to have you on because we talk about attribution a lot, but the way you summed it up and all of the research you've done, like I've received through your newsletter on attribution, has been amazing. So thanks for being on the podcast, Carey. It's so good to have you on.
It's great to be here. I'm excited. Thank you for the invite.
Yeah. Okay, so we typically start out with everyone's kind of ops journey, like their origin story, how they got into ops or to where they are now. And so just want to hear that from you. I almost feel like you've been on the podcast before, so I feel weird asking you.
I feel like we've talked a lot about this, and people may have heard this before, so I'll try to go through it pretty quickly. I'm probably most proud of my origin because I come from a background of graphic design, and that has been like probably one of the biggest bases for how I do things in marketing, because anything in graphic design is all about how to take complex ideas and distill them into something small. So if you really think about what a logo is, it's trying to like take the entire brand of a company and boil it down into a symbol. After doing design, I've worked at ad agencies and things like that. I ended up finding my way into the marketing world. I've always worked on small teams, but I started working in a SaaS company and doing both marketing and design. And then I was lucky enough to be there when we implemented Marketo. And so I've been working in Marketo for the last 10 plus years. When we did start adding Marketo, all of a sudden we had the ability not just to do marketing at scale, but to kind of have analytics that we hadn't had previously. And so I think that's what kind of began this merging in my career of the design and the data, and how do we use them really effectively. So that pursuit of like good design and, useful data has been really what I've tried to build my, consulting practice around, and the types of things that I've worked on different projects when I've been in-house. So that's kind of my origin story to how we got here today. And I'd like to think it'll probably keep going in the same direction. So it's something I'm very passionate about.
Yeah. I love that. Also, like a lot of the like the images that you use in your content or your graphics that you use in your content kind of like distill these like really, I think for a lot of people, attribution seems a little bit scary, or the way that we look at data can feel a bit like scary. But I think with a lot of MOPs folks, they're very visual people, like you're saying, like everyone. I was joking with Charlie yesterday because every time we put like a whimsical or something out there on LinkedIn, like people love it. And I think I'm like, oh, MOPs people just love a good Visio.
We love a good Visio.
we love graphs, but also just to take complex things and put it into something that people understand. And that's one thing I love. And what stood out to me in your do's and don'ts, like email, was just you documented a circle around like how to approach attribution, and that's like the data, the insight, you take action and repeat. And I'm like, wow, like that's like so good. Like you could just put that on your desk and just like, if you're an analytics person, just look at that. Just take the data, grab your insights, come up with an action and repeat. And I'm like, that's great. And I think you have a lot of different examples of that. And so I think it just lends really well to I think your work, and I'm sure you use this with your clients and they benefit, because if you're able to take those concepts and theories and display in a way where that you can like easily articulate it. And I think for a lot of people who aren't data literate, that is really handy. Must be really useful.
It is really useful. Thank you. I appreciate that. And I think it, even when you're speaking to someone data literate, which I like that word a lot, I think it's really important to simplify it because what's happening for all of us, and I think it's probably true even outside of marketing, is there's no shortage of data for
Oh
anybody,
yeah.
for in any field at all. And so, how do we show what's really important and what's important to take action on? Because we've all been generating these spreadsheets. People are our bosses are asking us to provide reporting. It seems like the
Hmm.
more reports we give, the more they want. But at the end of the day, how do you know what in that spreadsheet is useful? And so much of what I think the thing that makes me feel so passionate about this is that we should all be using data to do our jobs better. But unfortunately, it feels like our jobs have become generating data. And the data
Yeah,
is really kind of a byproduct, right? Like it's like we should be
totally.
doing marketing and then the data tells us how to do better marketing. But what's happening is we're being asked to create all these reports and prove marketing's influence. And that's not necessarily making us better marketers. And if we're not
Yeah.
doing better marketing, we're not necessarily bringing more revenue in. And at the end of the day, that's what we're all here to do: drive revenue for our own company or for the companies we work for or help my clients type thing.
Totally. I love that you said that because I think that that is something that we see across a lot of organizations is they keep they invest a lot of time, a lot of their like employees' time, a lot of consultant time, a lot of money into like just trying to just like you said generate more data, get better data. But I think a lot of the actual strategy of marketing like kind of gets missed. And so and then when you do have the data, it's like, how do we make this data look better for marketing? It's like, no,
Right.
just do better marketing,
Right.
like
Yeah, you're going
just
to
do more
fail.
marketing.
You're going
Yeah.
to run a campaign that like falls flat on its face. And instead of like trying to make the reports look like it wasn't so bad, like why don't you learn from that? And I think too, it's like okay to say like, hey, we ran this experiment. What we thought would happen didn't happen, but here's what
Yeah.
we learned, and here's how we're going to do it better next time. You know,
Yeah.
um, yeah,
Yeah,
but
totally. And I think that it's Rand Fishkin. I read a blog post by him recently talking about attribution, and um, he was also talking about too, like he, attribution fine, but like if you're spending so much time and dollars and it doesn't directly correlate to like even how much like marketing you're doing, like that's a miss. Like he's like, if you
right,
want to get attribution like perfect, you have to know that like you're probably going to invest a lot of money, you're going to have to get a certain tool. But if you want enough data or some actionable data to like just continue to make better decisions on your marketing, like
right,
it should correlate to how much marketing you're doing,
right,
and how much what your budget is and stuff like that. And I think that's like the simplest way to think about it. And then you also have to know that like more data, like you said, more data, and it doesn't always mean like that's the end goal. Like, oh, our
right,
end goal is to show how much we're doing. It's like really we always say like it's there to improve your marketing instead of prove your marketing. So
right. Yes, and it was
um
Allison, I think, who said that, like
yeah.
improve, not prove, and I'm like, that's spot on. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
All right. So I wanted to start with some of your do's and don'ts before we get into people's questions.
Hmm.
Carrie had sourced out some questions from LinkedIn from folks and tackling like their biggest questions on attribution. So we're going to get into that. But before that, I loved your email talking about the do's and don'ts
Hmm.
of attribution. So I feel like to start with that. So I'll start to read some of those out from the do's. So you
Okay.
say for do's to be consistent and develop a recurring process of reviewing your data to improve both the capture and value of the data.
Hmm.
So can you just add on a little bit there, and
Sure.
what are some ways that you can like try and make that part of your workflow? Because I think for some folks too, they always like wait until the end of the quarter or like do
Right.
something to like use the data, or like there's an event that like gets them to go look at that data, but it's not
Right.
really being consistent.
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of, I mean, For me, I'm one of those people that as soon as like I launch a campaign, I'm already looking at the reports and I'm like, hey, 3 people have opened. So I mean, I think like there's a level of like obsession of like wanting to know what happens, but I think that
Hmm.
if you're waiting for someone to ask you for the data, you may be like behind the curve there. And so I think what you want to be thinking is we're about to launch this. Like I begin most campaigns with like, how are we going to measure success for this one? And
Yeah.
branding, like sometimes it's just branding. It doesn't necessarily mean, it doesn't need to have a call to action. Like not
Yeah.
everything's like that, but whatever you're doing, you should kind of know how you're going to measure it. And so when you put out a campaign or campaigns, it should, you should have like kind of a recurring window when you're looking at it. So I mean, that's to me as simple as like checking in on your Google Analytics or looking at
Hmm.
your Marketo or Salesforce campaign reports, because what you want to see is like, are we seeing data come in the way we expect it? And you want to
Mm.
like at that point just be looking for anomalies. So, for example, if you run a campaign and you put UTM values on it, and then you notice in your web reports that you're not seeing those, did you share the wrong link? You know, like it's kind of about
Mm.
like both like reviewing the quality of the data, um, and then making sure that you're kind of like pacing as you go so that you're fixing it before it becomes a big problem. But
Hmm.
I don't expect people to be at that point analyzing the data. I would say it should just be like look in at a dashboard, look in at a report like every Friday, you know, like
Hmm.
your Friday mornings, like make it a quick thing that you do, spend a half hour making sure what you think is being tracked is being tracked.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And quality in, quality out. So if you
Exactly.
can make sure that happens at the beginning, that's it. And I love that because there's so many marketers have these oh shit moments of like,
Hmm.
oh no, we messed up this UTM, or oh we
All right.
forgot to, yeah, on the link. And then if you notice that months later, it's like, oh, you
Well,
lost your
yeah,
chance. So
exactly.
okay, the second thing you have as a do is aim for insights, not answers. Marketing will always remain an art form no matter how much data we throw at it. There are often multiple solutions to the challenge of understanding which activities drive pipeline revenue. Use your attribution data more as a compass than a map. I love this. We kind of already hinted at this,
Right.
but um, yeah, maybe talk a little bit about that. And then how do you kind of educate your clients, or even like for someone who's working with a CMO or someone who's kind of pressuring them to be like, hey, we need this data to show like our impact. Like how would you suggest handling that conversation?
I mean, I think if I were to like boil it everything down to one do, it would be this one, because I think this
Yeah,
idea of like insights, not answers. Um, I think I talk so much about this because I have trouble conveying this to people higher up. I mean, it's a really hard
totally.
thing to do. And someone asked me why they thought it was so hard the other day, and I've given some thought to why that would be. And I think part of the issue is that the data looks like attribution data looks like a fact. It's
Mhm.
illustrated on a spreadsheet. You can make a graph out of it. It's in Salesforce most of the time, or it's in Excel. It looks the same as like financial reporting data.
Yeah,
Um, and so I think there's this like expectation, and I think people's expectations with digital is that it's digital, therefore we know we can track everything. What do you mean this isn't tracking correctly? Type thing. So there's like the expectation that we should be able to,
mhm.
what we present looks like a fact. So why is there this gray area? And you know, at the end of the day, everything that we're measuring, it's still we're measuring humans.
Yeah.
And we'll never be able to assign intent to a human. You know, it's something as simple as someone asked me the other day, like, I remember 10 years ago when I was doing web design, you know, do we want to have more page views or less page views?
Mhm.
And then it's like, well, more page views might mean a person's really interested in your site. More page views might also mean they're not finding what they're looking for. So how do you
Oh,
know
yeah.
when you, and could be minor, but like these are the types of things we can't measure intent.
Mhm.
Um, so I think that when it comes down to this attribution data, this thought that it's we know everything about people, we know people are using their phones all the time. Like, why can't we get this exactly? It's never going to be exact. It's always measuring people, and so I
Yeah.
think that we should try to look at it as a whole and say like this is kind of teaching us something about something. People did come to this web page, so we can assume that this topic is important. So we have an insight there. And so we don't have an answer that that's the most important thing. We don't know that everybody who comes to that page is going to become an MQL and then an sale and a client. We don't know that, but we know that there's some value in it. So then we can start to do, it kind of dovetails into the next one, which is experiment with those insights. Is then you can take that action. You can say like, this topic seems to resonate with our audience. How can we put it in a different way? How can we promote it in a different spot and see if that matters? And so I'll pause here and take a breath because I tend to get going on this, but this is where it gets hard for CMOs because I think CMOs are being directed by CFOs, CEOs, like lots of layers that want an answer to something that there's simply not an answer. There's not an answer for. There are many answers. And so that's where I think like the idea of using attribution as an insight is a much better way than thinking that this is like, oh, this webinar is really important to driving pipeline. It's important, but it's not the only thing.
Totally. And I think one also thing is like, I love the martech space, but also sometimes the vendors and the tools also do people a disservice or their salespeople, because they're saying, hey, this is going to be giving you the data that you need to show your value to XYZ. And it's like, no, like stop telling like marketers this. Like we're selling them a dream that's literally like impossible. It's like what the world always does, right? Like a lot of marketing just preys on your insecurities, these like really, really false expectations of what you can do, and then tells you that this thing is going to do it. Like basically the beauty industry just
it is the beauty industry. It's the fitness industry. It's like, do this 5-minute exercise 7 days a week and you will drop 20 pounds. It's like, there's no way that will happen, but you're like excited about the prospect of it,
Totally. But to your point of like experimenting with the insight, which is your last two, I think this is the thing too, that because marketers go out and waste their time just trying to get the data perfect, trying to make sure every little team is attributed with the right data so no one gets their like feelings hurt, no one gets measured the wrong way. I think for you then are not doing those experiments. You're not making those changes on your strategy as fast as you can. And that's the whole thing with the data, is really like just helping you to just do better marketing and also figure out, are your experiments working? But then knowing that like there's some gut feel to it too, right? Like, and there's things that oh, this isn't showing up here, but this is probably like organic search has gone up 30%. Well, did you just launch a podcast? That could be why, like it takes a lot of like that, like you said, the analyzing like some things with your gut, with your experience, and then mixing and tying those insights together. But when you're just showing that in a report, like you said, that people think is like gospel, it's hard to articulate that.
Yeah. And a good example of that is I had a client who, when I started working with them on some visible reporting, they were not reporting on organic or direct website traffic. They weren't reporting on it. And I think that the reason why is that they weren't spending money on it. So like they didn't want to so the mentality, like, I think they were trying to do the best thing of like, well, we invest in these channels and these channels drive this. And we ended up opening that up and exposing it because I said like, what's going to happen is direct is the sum of all your marketing efforts. It's the sum of all the voicemails your salespeople leave. It's the sum of like your branding efforts over the last 10 years. And it's okay. And we're never going to know where those people came from. And if that number goes up, it's even better, like, because what it's showing is that at the end of the day, we're here to do marketing. We're not here to do marketing reporting, like if we took away all of our UTM codes and we dropped all of our attribution stuff and we kept marketing, hopefully we would still keep driving pipeline and revenue. But it's such a scary thing to be like, well, what do you mean? I mean, like 25 years ago, like you were doing focus groups, when we watch Mad Men, they were doing everything on, whiteboards and in a conference room where they were interviewing people. We're so far from that, but now we've gotten so afraid to do something where we can't measure the outcome.
Totally. And then that's hurting our marketing for sure. I think, And to your point with direct and like opening that up and being the result, I think I also say to companies too, like that's kind of a sign too that your cost of acquisition is going down,
Right.
because then that like that those are people that are coming through direct, but they are likely from your brand and things like that. And so
Mm-hmm.
for companies that are like, oh, I don't know how to measure my brand, it's like just look at your like cost of acquisition just from a pure leads perspective. If that's going down, it
Mm-hmm.
probably means that your brand's working, because people are just coming direct through you for the word of
Right.
mouth, like things they're seeing on Slack channels, things they're seeing on LinkedIn. You're not
Right.
going to be able to measure that directly, but you can like, put like a little, oh, I think this is
Oh, right.
happening.
Yeah. I think you're right though. There is this gut thing. And I think too, sometimes you're going to look at data and you're going to feel like it goes against your gut feeling. And you're going to be like, I really thought it was important to do that. And the data didn't show it. But your gut's well honed as well. Your gut's taking in all sorts of stuff that's not showing up on spreadsheets. It's remembering all sorts of like other things that have happened. And so that's where this blend of art and science comes in, is that you have to kind of like be willing to take your hands off the wheel a little bit and trust that good marketing over time um, is good marketing over time. You're doing the right
Yeah.
thing. So,
Yeah. The two
yep.
don'ts that I want to that kind of correlate to are do's, but I love your first don't, which is don't prioritize data over customer experience. The main goal is to provide your prospects with the easiest access to information that increases their interest in your company. Make decisions that support that goal as opposed to structuring your campaigns only to gather data. There's often a trade-off between customer experience and data capture. You need to find the right balance.
Yeah.
And I instantly think of the question of like, do we gate our white papers, or like
Right.
what do we use forms in front of?
Right.
And everyone is like, how are we going to capture that into our like visible reports or whatever it is?
Right.
And so yeah, I think that's an important thing. I think you mentioned like looking at Google Analytics, but what are some of your like what's some of your advice to clients who are maybe like, oh, I want to do these things, or I want to put this information out there but not gate it, but I still want to see how it's working? What do you tell clients then when they say that?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a really good point, because when you said that, the first thing, like, it always pops into our head, like, should we be gating our content? What should we be putting on the gate to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and a good example of this would be like, imagine you have a customer database, and you're going to send them something out regarding a new product you're offering, and you might have stuff out. You know who the customer is. You're sending out an email or social or whatever you're doing. You don't need to gate that. Like, your intent to gate that would be literally only to know which customers are interested in it, but your customers know who they know, you know who they are. So you want to, like, if you're doing something like that, you would go like, well, how could we track success if it's not a form fill? Well, it might just be looking at, like, did they actually end up visiting the page?
Mm-hmm.
Are we getting, I mean, like, sometimes the reports aren't direct, meaning like,
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to say, we did this email, we got this many customers interested, and this happened, because there's always going to be this time continuum. But what you hope is that over time you start promoting this new product, and hopefully your sales team is getting more phone calls about it or emails about it, or you're seeing
Mm-hmm.
more opportunities pop up with that line item. It's stuff like that. um it is that gating thing. And I think, like, you know, people are super savvy these days. I mean, this is
Mm-hmm.
something that I think we didn't like write down to talk about, but I think it's important as third party cookies get deprecated, and as more
Mm-hmm.
people put blockers on their websites, and Apple's not tracking I mean, like, Apple has had a lot of privacy. People deserve privacy.
Mm-hmm.
It's allowed, right? Like, I mean, all of
Yep.
us shop for things. We don't want to constantly be bombarded with
Mm-hmm.
somebody like asking us questions about, are you ready to buy it? Are you ready to buy? There's got to be this level of, like, kind of trust with your audience, that if you provide what they need, they will turn to you when they're ready to take that step. And your goal is to kind of be ready to kind of walk that
Mm-hmm.
journey with them, even if it's completely anonymous, even if you have no idea who they are. If you're providing the information they need to make that decision, it's kind of okay.
Totally.
And a lot of times what I will say is, like, to me, all of the metrics we track are just kind of fluff, except for things like revenue, pipeline, but even like beyond pipeline, we can't guarantee that. So I would say like revenue, customer retention, and employee retention, because those are
Totally.
three factually based things that everything else should be working towards.
Totally.
So if we're getting new business, if our customers are re-signing, all of that stuff means that our sales are working, our operations are working, everything's working together.
Totally. Yeah, that's something I was going to mention. Like, I think just look, like, no CMO is going to get fired if their revenue continues to
Right.
go up. Like, no one's going to lose their jobs if like people are hitting their company goals. Like, that's clear. So like, do as much as you can to just try and generate that interest. And I love that you said customer experience, because to your point, like, I think companies should be actually just optimizing those like capture points when people are interested, like you said, and focus your attention on that, and then just have good information that's easily accessible,
Mm-hmm.
and do it in a way where you just assume that those are anonymous buyers until they fill out that form, right? Like, just make it like really great for those typical people, the people coming to your website. So yeah, we had a past episode with Arthur Castillo from Chili Piper. And that's a really good one for people listening to this to go back and like, what is the best way to optimize that experience? But anyway, I want to make sure we get into some of the questions. The last don't that you have is don't chase perfection. And I think we kind of talked about that. Like, the reports are not the end goal. Like, we really like, it's really the data that we're using, and they're just tools. Like, I like that. Like, it's just a tool but you have other tools, your gut, you have your experience.
Right.
When you marry those all together, that's when good decisions are made. So
yeah. And I think one thing to consider is that like we're kind of like consistently imperfect, like
yeah,
across the board, a certain percentage of people are using private browsers. Okay, well, we know that. So we can just trust that the group that we have, we're going to use that as kind of our sample group. And so I think that the one thing that I really wish we could convey to CMOs and upper management is that every time we try to get closer to precision and perfect reports, we spend a tremendous amount of time and energy that could be used. Like, I hate to say sometimes good enough is good enough, because I think that always comes across as like we're not chasing mediocrity, but we need to know like what should be perfect. Like, our content should be perfect, our understanding of our audience should be perfect. Our reports don't have to be perfect if they're just helping us, make good decisions. Like, what's the next best step? That's what we want. We want a report that takes us to the next best step. We're not going to get a report like a lead gen and be like, and here's the 17 things that you must do to get that deal closed in 6 months. That doesn't exist.
Yeah, totally.
Yep.
So agree. All right. So let's dive into some of our questions.
Yes,
I'm trying to get through as many of them. So the first one, how important is it to ensure that your attribution data is clean and accurate? I feel like we kind of answered this, but
yeah, it's mostly important. It's important at the point that it's easy. Like, there's always going to be a point, like kind of like we can work real hard and get it to mostly perfect, and we can understand what's not perfect. This is one of those things that I'm sure has come up on multiple other episodes, but this is where duplicates will sometimes be your enemy. If you already had duplicates in your system, that will get exacerbated when you start attributing all sorts of stuff to 5 versions of a human instead of 1 version of a human. I think you should do your best at the point that it's not taking you like so much time to do your best.
Totally.
So, yep.
Cool. And then I think one thing I found out too is like we've been learning more about the tool Caliber Mine, if anyone's looked at that, and they kind of do some on their back end, do deduping, which I thought, oh, awesome.
Yes.
That's amazing.
That is amazing. That is a word that I think normal non-B2B people don't ever like dedupe. What does that mean?
Yeah. It's like, are you singing some song? What
is dedupe? Exactly.
Okay, the next one, which model should I use when? And I actually think that there was another question kind of related to it. Someone was saying they have a hard time with their enterprise sales team and showing like how to measure on like different like accounts, like because they have different criteria for how they measure influence. Right. But I think to start, like, if someone's like, what model should I use, or at least to start with, that's going to give me the best like insights they can use? What do you typically suggest?
I mean, the answer is going to sound kind of trite, but it's like use all of them. But I tend to break it down to like if I had to pick two models, I would pick first touch, or I would use a combo of like first touch or lead creation. So the difference between those, if you are jumping into attribution, first touch would be the very first time a person interacted with you. And if you're using a tool like Visible or Caliber Mind or Full Circle, a lot of times you can track that anonymously and store it until
Mm-hmm.
you know who the person is. And then lead creation is what we've all been typically used to with like lead source. So like
Yeah.
what made a person fill out the form. So then there's another model called U-shape that kind of splits the difference. So I tend to go with U-shape because I can't quite decide which one's more important. I can see value in both. But that's really your top of funnel. And I tend to recommend using U-shaped when you want an answer that's fairly quick. So the idea would be like you'd be using U-shaped to understand your demand gen processes, your lead gen and stuff. So if you want to know, was a paid search campaign effective, you could look at your U-shaped model and you would be able to see how many new, how many people you influence, how many net new names. But that's not necessarily going to tell you if they are the ones generating revenue. We can
Mm.
all fill our funnel with the wrong people, and that doesn't necessarily help us. So I tend to go towards something like a full path or an even split,
Yeah.
where we kind of like look, because what those two things are, and the difference between like U-shaped and I'm just going to say full path, which would include all of the touches along the way, is that the full path is going to actually give you a sense of how your marketing interacted with someone throughout the whole lead life cycle. The
Mm-hmm.
downside to that is that you often need at least an entire sales cycle to find
Mm-hmm.
value in it. So if you launch a tool like Visible today, but your sales cycle is 12 to 18 months, your full path models won't really be useful until, 12 to 24 months later, where you have enough time to measure. And most people can't wait that long to show value. So that's when you can
Mm-hmm.
like throw something in like a W shape that places a higher priority on like opportunity creation. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I tend to like an even split model, because how do I know if the right touch was assigned to the opportunity creation
Yeah.
or the lead close? So it's more just like, let's see what impacted our sales pipeline.
Totally. Yeah, we typically say that too, like the even spread. And I think part of the reason why that's really useful, um, from like just like the full picture kind of revenue perspective, like when you talk about customer experience and how that's like most important, and there's so many different touch points that people have across that experience and
Mm-hmm.
their journey. And it's so hard to say like what is the most important thing. Of course, you can gather that data maybe qualitatively from the
Right.
prospect, but it just gives you just a better sense of like what's working, what's not. And also, you could miss out on seeing effectiveness of sub channels just purely based on what the goal is. So like
Right.
field events or field and some type of field marketing efforts or direct mails and stuff like that will typically never show up, obviously, in like a first touch model
Mm-hmm.
only, or potentially even not even W shape, because depending on when that happened, it may
Right.
not get the credit. So that even spread just ensures that you're getting the data that like everyone can leverage, and getting the sense of like seeing trends of across the journeys. What are we seeing most show up or getting credit across like the board across these journeys? And then when you split that by region, it gets even more useful, because
Mm-hmm.
different regions might have more similarities like or differences in each other. So it just gives you, like you said, it's like a tool to just try and gather those insights to make changes or improve.
Right. Well, and something interesting, I mean, I think we can all think of an example in our own life when we bought something, but, like a year ago, I bought a car at CarMax. And I mean, I'm one person making a decision. I mean, my husband, it was my car, so my husband was involved, but we're not a buying team. We're just me. And like, I mean, I looked at the website, I called them, I was text messaging with them. Which interaction was the most important? Truthfully, all of them, because the
Yeah.
fact that they were available I bought from CarMax. I called other car dealers, but the whole process. And so you can't say, like, I always ask this question, like, if you look at Tom Brady and asked him, like, what was the most important thing that you did to win, what are we at, 7 Super Bowls now? There's not one thing that was the most important. It's the blend of all of it. And so we've got to stop looking for this, back to this thing about there is no answer. There is no like, do this, always, never do this. It's kind of like, well, do it all. Be where your customers need you to be when they need you to be there.
Totally.
And if you measure it, great. If you can't measure it, that's okay too. Right?
Yeah.
So
totally. I think one of the parts of the question too was, or this comes up a lot as well, when you have maybe you sell into large accounts, and maybe depending on like how many opportunities you have or the different like accounts that like structure, like do you work with any clients who maybe sell into enterprises, and do you have any suggestions for them to try and like make better sense of that data, especially when they may have like 100 contacts or something with that account?
I mean, I think it's kind of a little bit back to the customer experience. Don't prioritize reporting over customer experience, or prioritize customer experience. I mean, I think what's interesting to think is that you might be selling to an enterprise and they might be a buying team, but each of those people feels like an individual person doing research on something that matters. And the other thing to consider is that, like, from a salesperson's perspective, it's really important for them to be speaking to the decision maker. We want to identify them on the opportunity, but that might not be the person who's interacting with your marketing the whole time, at all. So I kind of recommend that you look at it like a little bit more, and this is where that even split comes into. It's like, if you're going to look at what influenced an opportunity, you do want to keep track of all the people on the account. And most good companies, I mean, I would hope if I were working for a larger company and they were about to roll out some sort of new software, I would be curious about it. And I would hope that they would take, probably a lot of organizations take feedback from their end users about what's going to be. So there's always going to be people like interacting with you socially. You're going to want to know, like, you're going to research and be like, how's the support for this product? There's all these different areas. And so I think that in terms of like, how do you measure it? It becomes a matter of like, don't try to think you're going to have like a perfect way of measuring it. Kind of like, look at all the activities in the pot that happen to everybody. And you might see that 15 people interacted via email, 2 people interacted at a trade show, 10 people interacted. And you kind of just want to like go like, okay, let's put all of this together and see what sort of insights we can gain from this.
Totally.
So
I want to dive into some of the specific channels, because especially one of them, I think when we look at this data and we talk about it helping marketers figure out better ways to market, a lot of times what comes up too is like from other teams, like how they can best leverage the data as well. So part of that is like, sales teams, they're doing like outbound sequences or cadences, or even just doing some outbound acquisition. There's also like reseller or partner channels. Maybe to start for like the sales piece, like how do you work with clients to like incorporate some of that data in, or do you tell them not to? Like, what's some of your suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, I think what sometimes makes attribution harder is that there's this perception that there might be one report that shows how everybody influenced the deal, and it would give us like, we have one report and it provides us one answer. And what you have to be very careful of is, because we have almost all of us in B2B, probably anybody in investing in an attribution tool has some level of a lengthier sales process, that we're going to have to expect. There's going to be a lot of complexities. There's a lot of data input. So how do we cut out the noise? A good example of this is like, and a lot of tools will allow you to include sales activities as well as marketing activities. And that's really useful. And I think like when a person's trying to understand, if leadership is looking and saying like, I want to see how each department is impacting the sales process, that might be one reason to take a look at that report. But I don't know that that actually is that useful. The reason being is it puts a lot of noise in the system. And a really good example of this is I was working with a client on a visible optimization, and they were tracking sales activities. And so they placed a high priority on like a demo, which makes sense, right? Like your sales rep spends time doing the demo. What happened was almost everybody got a demo, which makes sense because you're going to need to demo something to sell it. And so that particular touch looked really important in the sales process, but it wasn't a differentiator. It wasn't like some people got a demo and some people didn't. So if I have to like help, if we need to really clarify what should be tracked and what should not, I tend to say track the areas where decisions might be different if you do something. So, for example, you would never put like contract signing as something you're measuring because everybody has to sign a contract. It doesn't matter. There's no doing this or not doing this. And so I always recommend your channels and your touches should be based upon where you're going to invest more time or where you're going to invest more money. And so if there is something different that a sales team can do, um, then that's a good place to track. But I would also probably recommend you might be better off to be using, a simple Salesforce report that tracks, an activity and an event report. Don't try to cram all of this information into one report because it doesn't matter. It's just not going to be like you can't conscientiously figure it out.
Yeah. Or I think one thing too, like if it's something that they're collaborating with marketing on, so if it's part of like an integrated marketing campaign and that cadence or some like sequence is part of that, like making sure that that's like part of the piece that you're measuring, I think makes sense because it's like, oh, did that ABM
Right.
campaign have a better lift because of the sequence? So and
Right.
like which if you're testing or experimenting different sequences, then you can kind of see that data. But to your point, like you could also get that data in other ways with how you sync the data over to activities or and then tie those to opportunities. So just kind of make your best judgment on what's going to be the simplest way, and also like how often or how much of that data are you actually going to use. I think if you have to really put in the effort, I feel, if it's actually going to end up being useful and used instead of just
Right.
across the board, oh, it's something we're doing, I need to
Right.
make sure it's measured perfectly.
Right. A lot of times I'll have like, someone will say like, my boss asked me for this report. And the first question I ask is like, well, do you know how they're going to use that? And often it's like, I don't know, they just asked me for it. And it's hard because obviously
Yeah.
we all are beholden to people. But I think that's where like, as a marketer, you want to try to get ahead of it. You want to say, this is the data we're measuring, and this is why, and this is what we're going to take action on. And you always want to assign some sort of action based on the data so that if somebody comes to you and says, I need this data, you can say, I'm happy to help you with that. Can you explain how you're going to use that data? And if they don't have a good answer, it's a lot easier to push back. So I think like it's a little bit of that like give and take. And I want marketers to have like a bigger ownership in the data creation and data analysis from the beginning so that they're not being, for lack of a better word, pushed around by someone who's been told by a sales rep that this is possible,
I
So,
love that.
yeah.
Yeah. All right. Do you have time for one more?
I do.
Okay, I want to make sure we talk about this because some of the folks had asked about dark funnel and how should I think about dark funnel when it comes to multi-touch attribution, or how do you think about attributing things that you can't see or capture? I think we've kind of talked about this a little bit, especially when
Right.
you ungate stuff, but specifically, there's a lot of conversations out there around dark funnel and how attribution fails to measure it, which I think it's important to note that like all models aren't perfect, and so we can't just focus on the failure points. We should just talk
Right.
about a solution. But
Right.
what would be kind of your suggestion to a client when they're thinking through that?
Yeah. I mean, I think like I really hate the term dark funnel because I think everybody wants to, like, we all want to be in the dark when we're searching until we're ready. So we are all in somebody's dark funnel. I think about this all the time. Like, I filled out a form on somebody's website the other day. I am somewhere in their dark funnel because I'm doing something. Um, I think that that's where this idea comes into. We've got to like kind of back off this idea of an answer or back off this idea of impressions. If we just assume that 10 to 15% of all of our activities are not trackable, then we can say like, well, what can we learn with the 85% that we can? I think Chris Walker does a fantastic job of talking about this, the dark funnel. But I mean, I think the other thing is we've got to let go of this idea that this should all happen like automatically. It should all happen at scale on a spreadsheet. Like maybe ask your customers, like once they all, and like maybe you ask them once they're already a customer, and that could be a conversation that you have on. And then this goes to like what you mentioned about gut feeling. Like I don't like a model where sales is, kind of in their silo and marketing's in the other. It'd be great if we're all working together. And so like your sales rep is probably talking to these people more often and they are probably letting this information slip in a conversation because they're sharing. So if your sales rep is astute and can like write that down, then it can be a conversation and be like, well, I talked to a lot of people last week that really enjoyed the podcast.
Totally.
And that should be enough. Like, we don't have to like, well, how are we going to get that into a spreadsheet?
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, that's something that comes up a lot, and it's funny. I still even remember the first time, like I think it was like 5 or 6 years ago, but I was like talking to Charlie, and I'm like, we were talking together about how people are spending all this time like trying to figure out attribution. We're like, just like ask them, just ask your prospect. Like if you want to, like SDRs are looking, or salespeople are looking for icebreakers anyway. If you just make that as part of your process, like, how did you first find out about us? What's something that stood out? Like, and those are things that you can, capture just within somewhere in Salesforce, or they can, like you said, they can note it down. You can meet with your sales team. Now with smart tools like Gong and stuff, you could even maybe like have events that are listening for that and get the data back to you. So I think that, like you said, like, there's ways that you can be creative to try and get some of that information. And then that's just another tool that you can then tap into to add on to the insights that you can, use to take action and then repeat.
It's funny, like a strange example that comes up in real life is like, I don't know if you've ever done like a calorie tracker or anything like that. Like, I mean, I've done it at various phases of my life. And then sometimes I would use that calorie tracker and I would eat really healthy throughout the day. And then I would just get tired of tracking.
Yeah.
Which is fine. It was helping me do what I needed to do, which was to eat better. But if I were to try to go back and look at like reports of like the calories, be like, I don't think I ate 450 calories that day. I stopped tracking, but I still did. And so this idea that everything has to be documented with precision, these tools are kind of like what a calorie tracker is. It's designed to help you do better in the moment. It doesn't necessarily carry intrinsic value to be measured year over year, day over day, that type of stuff. So
totally.
Yep.
Yeah, I've been doing that sometimes with like my journal, because I do a lot of the same questions every single day at the end of the day, and then I'll flip back. I'm like, oh, I want to flip back and see like how the last 4 weeks have gone, or was I feeling this way like a month ago? I am a woman. This is probably telling me something. But it's data that, like, yes, it's not perfect every time. It's very informal. I'm just jotting notes into a book, but it gives me those like that data set that I can look back to and then try and draw some conclusions, and then take it for what it is.
Take it for what it is, and then you've done your best and you move on. So it's good.
Awesome. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm sure everyone listening did too. For those of you who enjoyed it, I highly suggest you go to Condurrio.com, where you can find Carey's website and see a bunch of her content. She has a blog post. Also, you can sign up, and I think to join your newsletter, right, Carey?
Yeah. And I only send it out like a little bit here and there. Sometimes I don't even have calls to action in my newsletter, just to let you know. It's real low pressure.
I'm a subscriber and I really like it, as I mentioned. So definitely suggest you folks check it out. And if you did enjoy this episode of Forward Thinking, feel free to give our page a like and share it with your colleagues and friends. And we'll see you next time. Thanks so much, Carey.
Thanks, Chrissy. Great to chat with you as well.